Justice. That is what comes to mind when I think of Bob Herbert. Decency, outrage, integrity, and the desire to make a difference. At the Kennedy Presidential Library, we see public service as a legacy left to us by the 35th president. There's no roadmap, no one way to create a better world, but the destination is justice. And Bob Herbert, whose stories and observations of Americans left behind enrich us every Monday and Thursday on the op-ed page of the New York Times, guides us down the road. I want to read you a few words. Dangerous changes in American life are indicated by what is going on in America today. Disaster is our destiny unless we reinstall the toughness, the moral idealism which has guided this nation during its history. The paramount interest in oneself, for money, for material goods, for security, must be replaced by an interest in one another, an actual, not just a vocal interest in our country, a search for adventure, a willingness to fight, and a will to win, a desire to serve our community, our schools, our nation. So if we are uneasy about our country today, perhaps it is because we are truer to our principles than we realize, because we know that our happiness will come not from the goods we have, but from the good we do together. We say with Camus, I should like to be able to love my country and still love justice. The man who said those words, Robert F. Kennedy in 1959. And the speaker tonight who helps live out that legacy, who still loves justice and who lists Robert Kennedy among his heroes, is Bob Herbert. Bob joined the New York Times as an op-ed columnist in 1993, and as most of you know, he covers politics and social issues. I highly recommend his new book. It's called Promises Betrayed, Waking Up from the American Dream. It's on sale in our bookstore, and Bob will be signing books after this forum. Prior to joining the New York Times, Bob was a national correspondent for NBC News and a reporter, editor, and member of the editorial board of the New York Daily News. He has won numerous journalism awards and chaired the Pulitzer Prize jury for spot reporting in 1993. His reporting and his columns have led to the overturning of dozens of wrongful convictions and the release of numerous innocent people from prison. Moderating tonight's forum, it's a pleasure to welcome back here WBUR's Dick Gordon, host of The Connection. Prior to joining BUR, Dick was senior correspondent for the Canadian Broadcast Company's National Current Affairs radio show This Morning, and in a world of too much frothy journalism, Dick reports with excellence on issues of real substance. He has covered the conflicts in Bosnia, Afghanistan, and Indonesia among his vast experience in overseas reporting. He has also been honored with 2 Gabriel Awards and 2 National Journalism Awards. Please join me in welcoming Bob Herbert and Dick Gordon.
Thank you, Deborah, and thanks to all of you for coming to another one of these forums, an opportunity to exchange some ideas and hear some new ones from the excellent guests that the Kennedy people always manage to find to sit up here and on stage with me. I'm not sure if many or any of you had a chance to hear The Connection earlier today. Bob Herbert was my guest today in the second hour, and so I'm driving down to this session and thinking to myself, so do we make this part 2 or do we cover any of the old ground? And fortunately with a guest like Bob, that's actually not much of a problem, because there was so much left unsaid earlier that to pick up that conversation I think is perhaps the best way of going. The name of Bob's new book, Promises Betrayed, Waking Up from the American Dream. I asked him earlier today whose promises were betrayed. And I was thinking after he left the studio today, waking up from the American dream, why you chose that? Because in a way, is that meant to be a bad thing, waking up from the American dream, or a good thing?
I think it's not a good thing to wake up from the American dream. The whole idea of the American dream is the symbolism that you are moving to a better place. I mean, that's the way I've always seen it. The reason people have always been so desperate to come here from around the world is, I think, essentially because they think of the U.S. as a place where you'll be treated fairly and you'll encounter expanding opportunities. So you can come here and build a family and have a better life for your kids, say, than the life you may have right now. For Americans who are already here, it's essentially the same. You take a lot of that for granted. Fairness and justice, sure, that's what we stand for. It's not perfect, but we're getting to a better place. But most especially that you're going to be able to improve your quality of life, and if not yours, significantly, certainly your children and your grandchildren. And when I say waking up from the American dream, I'm saying essentially that is not the case in the same way that it was before. And I took as my starting point the period when I was growing up, which was the 1950s and the 1960s. And I tell everybody, life wasn't better then than it is now. Life is better now than then. But there was a sense that we were moving in the right direction then. It was relatively easy, even if you didn't have a college degree, to get a good job with good benefits, a bit of security. It was becoming easier for people of modest means to get a college education. It was a period of the civil rights movement, and very soon there would be the women's movement, there would be the gay rights movement, the environmental movement. So there really was this sense that there was that things were happening and life was improving on a broad front. I don't think that's the case now. For people even who have good jobs and who have a decent education now, they tell you, well, you should expect to change jobs 4 or 5 times in the course of your career. Healthcare is becoming healthcare on the job is becoming harder and harder to come by. Retirement security, for a lot of people, they're thinking that's becoming a thing of the past. Excuse me, we're rolling back on those things, the safety net issues. During the Clinton administration, I was opposed to the changes in welfare, which they used the name welfare reform for. It wasn't reform. It was taking money away from needy kids. I knew then that it would just be a very short time before they would be going up the income ladder and rolling back on safety net issues for working people and for the middle class. And sure enough, we're beginning to see it with Medicare. We're beginning to see it with Social Security. So I think that we're going in the wrong direction now. And, I think it's interesting that you don't see a lot of people using the term American Dream anymore.
It's interesting. I made a little note here of the list of things that were considered important at the time when you were describing in the 60s. Civil rights, women's rights, environmental rights, just to name 3 of them. And anybody who was growing up at that time felt that they had the opportunity to choose some place to make their life better and to make their neighborhood's life better. What will be my priorities? Are you saying that people don't care about that anymore, or people are being taught that that's not important anymore?
It's closer to the latter. I know that there's an awful lot of people who care about it still, because I can see it in the emails that I get, in the mail that I get at the Times, telephone calls, and that sort of thing. But I am just such a big believer in leadership, which is what I thought was so important that came out of the Kennedy family with Jack and Bobby, and continuing with Ted Kennedy. I think it's very difficult for big changes in a society to occur without leadership that is both smart and energetic, and also is positioned in a way to have some clout. And I just think that there was leadership in the 50s and 60s and maybe moving into the 70s that was committed to ideals that I think are important that simply is not there now. I think the public will follow strong leadership in almost any direction. So you can have people following the liberal policies of Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s and following the conservative policies of Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. And I think now we're in a period that's pretty stagnant as far as inspired leadership is concerned.
Or you could say that people will follow this president to a belief that Social Security needs to be radically changed. I mean, are you saying that he has the capacity to do that?
Sure, or that we should roll back on civil rights and human rights, that it's no longer important to ensure that the people that you sweep up and incarcerate are in fact guilty, or that they have a chance to, in a reasonable way, protest their innocence? Sure. You can get the public to follow you in a lot of directions that aren't that healthy for a society.
I'm glad you mentioned President Kennedy, because there was a line in your book which jumped out at me, and with your indulgence, I'm going to read it. You wrote that the United States was always at its best at those points in history when it chased its cherished ideals, like a mariner following the stars. And in fact, in the last chapter of the book, Herbert's Heroes, you go first at astronauts and say that those people kind of stand apart from others in this country, in modern history of America as heroes. And I wanted to just hear you speak a little bit more about that, why you singled them out, for example.
One of the things that strikes me about the astronauts is, one, they were chasing a dream. I mean, when President Kennedy said, if I can get it correctly, that we're going to
you'll be corrected if you miss one word here, I warn you.
Well, essentially, we're going to land a man on the moon and bring him safely back to Earth before the end of the decade. So that's chasing a dream. I mean, he didn't know if you were really going to be able to do that in the time frame that he specified. But it was chasing a dream, and it was also essentially a nonpartisan dream. It wasn't right versus left. It wasn't Democrats versus Republican. In 1969, when people were sitting there, looking at the moonshot, the ones who believed it, looking at the moonshot, they weren't thinking that this was a Democrat or a Republican initiative. And I think that that's what we've gotten away for. If you went into the post-World War II era, where you had the GI Bill and you had to build housing for the families that would become the baby boomers, for example, when Eisenhower talked about the interstate highway system, which I think is really interesting, that I guess the driving force was the fact you'd be able to move missiles along these highways. But in any event, the interstate highway system, I mean, people didn't really, the ordinary Americans, think of those in terms of partisan politics, left versus right. This was the sort of thing that you needed to do to build a great nation. And we've really gotten away from that. So, what kind of nonpartisan initiatives can you think of now that Americans can really rally around and say this is important because it's going to advance the cause of our country, of the vast majority of Americans? Okay,
so let's go to another one of your heroes, Sergeant Shriver.
Sergeant Shriver is surprising. I mean, when I put together the column on Sergeant Shriver, I couldn't believe how long ago it was that Sergeant Shriver had come to my attention, but we don't need to spend a lot of time talking about that. But Sergeant Shriver and the Peace Corps, I mean, just start there. Once again, an initiative where you're going to go beyond the borders of the United States and help to make a better world. Young, idealistic kids, neither left nor right, and it just sort of, in my view, exporting the American dream. And I just remember that there were just so many families who either had kids who were involved or who just thought that this was a wonderful initiative on the part of the United States.
I can't tell you how many people call up our program when we're dealing with an international story and preface their remark by saying, I was with the Peace Corps in X, and here's what I learned about that country at that time.
And one of the fabulous things about the Peace Corps was that you got beyond the borders of the United States and you met some folks who were different. You'd see a culture that was different. You'd make friends across cultural lines. And that experience, I mean, almost I don't care who you are, that kind of experience stays with you for a lifetime. I mean, a lot of times it happens in war, which is tragic. But how often have we heard veterans of foreign wars come back and 30, 40, 50 years later, the experience is just right there, so vivid. You listen to the conversation. Something similar happens if you engage people in other cultures, and it's not a wartime situation. It's a more constructive situation, but it's still it builds something into you that just stays with you. That's very positive and constructive for the rest of your life.
You said something to me earlier today, and we actually got a number of emails about this at the program, and I was glad that we did because people were listening. When you said that it's time to go back to the draft, and the conversation about
this is where my liberal friends bail out on me.
Except that when you're talking about the original idea of the Peace Corps and that idea of national service, unless I misunderstood you, your idea of going to the draft makes space for that kind of service to the country.
I think that all Americans should do 2 years of national service. It does not have to be in the military. I'd love to see people out there in the community. You could work with the homeless. You could work with the poverty-stricken. You could do literacy work. Almost anything you can imagine. I would really like to see that. And one of the benefits of that is more of a sense of community, that this is a venture that we're in together. I mean, people like to talk about patriotism and, waving the flag, but I notice, they talk about patriotism, and then it's Desperate Housewives and, let's get TiVo so we don't have to see the commercials. Well, I don't know, whatever it is. It was patriotism a moment ago. Well, if patriotism is supposed to mean something, then there needs to be some kind of effort behind the slogans. And if it really means anything, it means that we are in this thing together, that there should be some kind of collective effort where we're going to do whatever we could. It doesn't have to be huge. We're going to do whatever we can to improve our society. And it builds that sense of community that makes patriotism something other than, just a pretty word. And so that's the kind of national service that I'm thinking of. It would include the military as well, because obviously you have to defend the country. But if you're going to fight wars, then you need to draw your warriors from a broader slice of the electorate, of the population, than we're doing now. So one of the reasons we are not more outraged about what's going on in Iraq is that there are not that many Americans who feel that they have a personal stake in what's going on in Iraq. It's over there, and somebody other than our kids are fighting it. The kids are fighting. I mean, there's so many people from the reserves, from the National Guard. When I was in the Army, they were referred to as weekend warriors. I mean, they would only be called up in a national emergency. So these were kids who sometimes joined for an extra paycheck. They came from families that didn't have a lot of money, who joined for an opportunity to advance their education. In some cases, they just simply needed a gig. They didn't think they would be fighting in the kind of war that they're fighting in Iraq, and not only fighting there, but going back over there for 2 and 3 sessions, which I think is really a sadistic thing to do to somebody. If you're unfortunate enough to land in a war zone and you spend your year there and you survive and you get home to see your family, you shouldn't have to go back there 6 or 8 or 10 months later. What I think is that if more families felt that their sons and daughters would be likely to go off to fight a war in Iraq, we would never have been there in the first place, or given the situation now, we'd be trying to wind it down as quickly as possible. But that's not the case. And I'm not naive. I don't think that we're nearing a draft, but I think that we should have a draft.
I'm curious to know what it was like for you to go back over 5-6 years, because I think that's about as far back.
I'll never do it again.
You didn't like going through some of your old writing?
You read a column 15 times, 16. It's like, all right, I saw that column. I'm out of there.
Well, here's why I'm bringing it up. I found it really interesting going back through the columns that you'd written about this war. Right. I saw columns written 2.5 years ago where you were puzzling out what was going on. There's a kid, Sergeant Eugene Simpson, paralyzed from the waist down. You meet him in the basement where he basically watches television, and you say, so, what are your thoughts about this? And he says, what was our purpose? And to this day, I still can't figure out our purpose for being there. And you just leave it there. It's just like it hangs.
See, that's what I think, and I think the media has fallen down here. That's what I think the public doesn't understand about the war, the general public. how hideous it really is. So if you're sitting, this was down in a small town in Northern Virginia. If you're sitting in the basement with this fella who, he was an athlete. I mean, I guess he was in his mid-20s. Great-looking guy. He's an athlete. He's got that build of an athlete. He loved to play basketball and football. And he's confined to a wheelchair. I mean, he's paralyzed from the waist down. From the waist up, he's that ordinary, healthy, young kid that's got a whole life ahead of him. And in fact, he was married. He'd been stationed in Germany. He's married to a German woman. He's had a couple of kids. He's trying to get them in the States.
And that wasn't too easy.
Right.
It's another part of the story.
So you're sitting there and you're wondering, or I'm saying to myself, if you're going to put a young man like this in a situation where he might become paralyzed for life, you have to have a really good, clearly articulable, is that a word?
Articulate works, I think.
Reason. I mean, you need to be able to explain to him, to his family, and to the public at large why we're going to put him in a situation where this might happen. But we don't have any kind of explanation like that. But two, we don't really have the media focusing on these. I think it's now 10 to 15,000 American troops who have been just terribly wounded by this war, paralyzed, hideously burned, lost limbs. I mean, I saw there was a woman we were talking about the other day who had lost both of her legs, a young woman. Well, you know, they ought to be on the television screens all the time when you turn on the news. Not, you know, Michael Jackson or Martha Stewart or, you know, the latest promo for the Runaway Bride or something like this. You know, let's hear about the young men and women who are having terrible things happen to them. And then if we decide as a nation that this is an issue that's important enough for us to put these youngsters in harm's way, then fine, that's a decision that you can make. You know, and then I go back to my other point. If you come to that decision, then you need to draw from a larger segment of the population.
And when I read what you're writing about the Iraq War now, I think I hear or read more outrage in your voice. Now you are reflecting back on what we continue to learn about Abu Ghraib, the responsibility or who's having to carry the blame over that. You still do your reporter's gig. You're still out of your office in New York meeting some of these kids who continue to come back injured from the war. But I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me when I get to look over a period of time at your writing about this war, you're angry, a lot angrier today than you were 2 years ago.
Well, I am. I mean, you know, anyone who read the column knew that I was opposed to the war. But once you launch a war, once you're in a war, you know, you have to win the war. I mean, I don't want the United States out there losing wars. That's insane. So if you're going to win the war, then, you know, you go to something like the Powell Doctrine. I mean, you know, George Bush, the father, understood it initially. We didn't have it clear in Vietnam. We had it clearer in the first Gulf War. But if you're going to go to war, you got to win the war. So Powell says you need an overwhelming force going in. You need to be very specific about your objectives, and you need to have an exit strategy. Well, we had none of the above. So, you know, we're the most powerful and the wealthiest nation in the history of the world, and that's the way you go to war. You go to war with not enough troops. I mean, General Shinseki's comments now are famous. You know, he said you needed hundreds of thousands of troops to pacify Iraq, and they said, you know, Rumsfeld and the president said, that's nonsense, you're out of here, and his career was over. So we go over there without enough troops. We go over there with troops who are not properly trained for the combat conditions that they're going to face. A lot of them are the reservists and the National Guard people that I'm talking about. 70% of the casualties were from these roadside bombs, and yet we have this miserable record in providing the necessary protective armor for the Humvees and the other vehicles who are carrying the Marines and the soldiers around. If anybody understands the exit strategy that we've got going for this war, I hope in the question and answer period they tell me, because as soon as I hear it, I'm going to write a column about it. But I don't understand the exit strategy yet. I don't understand the goal yet. You know, we were not told that we were going to war for regime change. We were told that we were going to war for weapons of mass destruction, which sounded weird in the first place, but, so that's where we are now. We're in a war where we don't know how to end it, and we don't know how to win it. And that's what the situation was in Vietnam.
And so I have to think that you're getting a lot of email from readers and people who give you feedback on the stuff that you're writing.
Can't use that kind of language here.
But even censored, I bring to this my own experience working on my program. The criticism is easily kind of put in a box as that's from the left or that's the Democrats, and therefore that's political.
Right.
And once it becomes political, it can be set aside and not taken that seriously. And so where do you see this reaction, this outrage taking shape that is somehow outside those boxes, so it needs to be paid attention to?
That's where you really need leadership to come in. I mean, I don't think the Democrats have provided any kind of useful alternative to the administration on this war. I mean, during the last campaign, it was very hard to see the distinction between John Kerry and George W. Bush on the war in Iraq. I mean, what the political leaders who might be able to see this stuff a little more clearly than I think the administration sees it, what they need to do is explain clearly to the public, and I'd like the media to convey it properly, how this is not a left or a right issue, that if the country is at war, it really is a collective effort, and you need to prosecute this war in the best, most efficient way possible. And instead, you get this vague sense out there of either people who might have criticism about the war being afraid to speak up, afraid of being labeled unpatriotic, or just a sense maybe of, well, I'd love to see Bush, something terrible happen in terms of the Bush administration, so maybe if we don't do that well in Iraq, it'll be bad for him politically. You have all these weird things rather than the idea of a collective effort of a nation at war trying to achieve an objective. So while you have all these vague things playing out, essentially politics as usual, you also have people being killed and maimed. I mean, and that's the part that seems to have been forgotten about. When we see the coverage on television, it's primarily about power politics and not about the human cost, which is just unbelievably terrible, the human cost of war.
In one of your earlier pieces, you wrote about how passive Americans have become. In that piece, you weren't writing about war, you were writing about the unemployment rate, the number of homeless on the street.
Right.
I'm wondering if it's that same passivity that is a part of the conversation about the war that either takes place in a political forum where it's kind of packaged in a crossfire way. We'll debate the war for half an hour
Right.
and take a commercial and then go to Desperate Housewives,
Right.
Rather than allowing people to feel like they can have that conversation either outside the political parameters that are set. I mean, the passiveness of citizens.
I'm starting to think, maybe I'm coming late to the game, but I think that passivity is the rule, that the public at large is generally passive, that you don't have like this sort of spontaneous outrage, that when the outrage comes, it is somehow stoked by leadership that can clearly articulate what the issues are and what's at stake. And even in Vietnam, which is sort of the symbol of the public rising up and protesting and supposedly bringing a war to an end, it didn't really occur that way. I mean, I got drafted in the early build-up for the war in Vietnam. I did not go to Vietnam. I went to the luck of the draw. I went to Korea. A lot of my friends went to Vietnam. But for the first few years, you heard very little objection to the war. The polls showed the public strongly in favor of the war, and Lyndon Johnson was not in any political trouble at all for his administration's position on Vietnam. What finally happened, I think, what began to turn the table was the fact that so many college kids who were able to get deferments, the war went on so long that they could do their 4 years in college and get a degree and still be eligible to be drafted. And, they were trying they couldn't send draftees over there for more than one term. They did send other kids over for 2 or 3 shots at the war. But the draftees were only in the Army for 2 years, so they began to run out of people, and more and more people became vulnerable to the draft. And that's when you began to see the movement on the college campuses, the peace movement. That's when it really kind of hit critical mass. Then in addition to that, the war went on so long and was so costly, it began to take a toll on the workings of government. I mean, it became like an economic shell game for Lyndon Johnson. He was losing his Great Society, which was very popular at the time, and there were other economic problems, trouble balancing the budget, and then the public finally was beginning to get fed up with this war. But look how long it went on before we finally got the heck out of there.
You think the budget
Terrible thing.
aspect of this war is eventually going to be something that causes them to focus on it in a way that they haven't yet so
I think
far?
sooner rather than later. But it's going to be really interesting to see, I can't at this point imagine the scenario in which the United States extricates its troops from Iraq. I mean, Iraq is even different from Vietnam. You have so many factions in Iraq, and then you've got the whole oil issue there. So I can't imagine the United States just pulling its troops out and giving up what it essentially has, which is, I think, essentially a permanent base right there at the hub of that Middle Eastern oil supply. So what happens when the public really does get fed up, and I think that's beginning to occur now, that's when you're going to get a conflict probably between public opinion, and if you have the Bush administration or a subsequent administration that feels the way the Bush administration does, then I think you'll really have a clash.
Where in your mind does a generation of inspired leaders come from? Do things have to get really bad before people take it upon themselves to say, if I don't get involved, then we get more of the same?
Yeah, I think that helps, which is a shame. But sometimes, it's almost like spontaneous combustion. I mean, leaders just seem to, in some cases, come out of nowhere. When you look at, this is not because I'm here at the Kennedy Library. I mean, I was just such an enormous fan of Jack Kennedy and especially Bobby Kennedy back in the 1960s. But, where the heck did Jack Kennedy come from? It was not like in the beginning people thought like these great things were going to come from Jack Kennedy, and nobody had even, for the most part, back in the mid to late 50s even heard of Bobby Kennedy, So who could imagine that they would end up being such great leaders and such amazing historic figures in the United States? I mean, people would have said so much more would have come from an Adlai Stevenson, or so much more would have come from an LBJ, for example. So sometimes you just can't tell. And maybe it's wishful thinking on my part, but I sort of hang my hat on that. Those leaders may be out there right now ready to be discovered. Maybe next week one of them will be the subject of a column if I'm lucky or something. You just can't tell.
There's a piece that you wrote recently about this fellow Arkan Muhammad Ali, the 26-year-old Iraqi who was tortured at Abu Ghraib. And if I'm not mistaken, correct me if I got this wrong, because my notes got a little muddled up, but he's the one now who's behind a suit against Defense Secretary Rumsfeld?
He's one of a number of plaintiffs in that suit, yeah.
The reason I mention his name and that column in context of the conversation about leadership is I'm curious to know if you think how far up the chain of command some of the...
I mean, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. You knew where I was going with this.
When I look at the easy part of the Abu Ghraib thing are the scandalous photos. I mean, everybody's essentially of one mind about that. But if you look a little more closely at the troops who were in that photo, you know, Lizzie England and the guy, I forget his name, Grainer, who was her boyfriend. I mean, what were they doing there in the first place? I mean, I can't. I mean, Lindy England. I can't imagine that Lindy England was even qualified to be in the armed forces. I mean, I don't think she should have been there at all. But the fact of the matter is the abuses that were going on at Abu Ghraib were initiated by the Bush administration when they decided, you know, we're going to turn our back on the Geneva Conventions and we're going to give a wink and a nod to the idea that torture is wrong, and we're going to turn our dogs loose on whoever it is they come up with. Not the guilty parties, not the people who may have been involved in the attack against the United States, not the people who are fighting our forces, but just anybody that gets caught up in these enormous sweeps. And we're going to put them in camps, and they're not going to have any rights at all. They're not going to be able to confront their accusers. We're not going to tell them what the charges are. We're not going to allow them to see a lawyer, and we're going to treat them in the most degrading way possible. That's how this thing got initiated. It's not a secret. It's in the public prints. So when it becomes scandalous because some photos get out to 60 Minutes or CNN or whatever, oh, suddenly we're going to have an investigation, and we're not going to tolerate this, and we're going to crack down on this. So Lindy England, we're going to have your head, and that's where it stops. Excuse me. I mean, I just think that it's insane. So when we're investigating this and we're looking at the folks who did the wrongdoing, sure, you start with the obvious suspects, but then you work your way all the way up the chain of command, and you let it go to wherever it naturally stops. And in this case, I think it stops with Donald Rumsfeld. I think it stops with John Ashcroft. I think it stops with President Bush.
You were a soldier. You wore a uniform. You know that there have been, I lost track, I have to tell you, 6, 7 investigations, all conducted by military people. Is the Army physically incapable of investigating itself?
Sure. I mean, it's really interesting. If you look at the way these investigations were set up, they were set up so that they were only going to investigate, essentially, for the most part, lower-ranking personnel. Or if they got to the officer corps, they would only investigate in a narrow focus in terms of the jurisdiction that the officers were working in. So we can investigate this company, or we can investigate this battalion. In some cases, only recommendations could be made for avoiding this kind of behavior in the future, but not take steps to punish the guilty individuals who may have been involved, and certainly not take steps for the collapse of the command structure, which is what happened at Abu Ghraib, for example. So this stuff is carefully choreographed for public relations purposes. It's not set up as a way to achieve justice, to punish the guilty, and to establish a new regime that will go forward that would really be intolerant of these kinds of abuses. There's been nothing along those lines at all.
You've talked of striking something like the 9/11 Commission.
Sure,
as a way of looking into this. Do you think it'll happen?
No, I don't think it'll happen, because I don't think there's... One of the problems is we have essentially one-party government. Can you just imagine what the Republicans would have been like if Bill Clinton had conducted this war the way George W. Bush has conducted this war? What would the Republicans have been like if Hillary Clinton had been president and her response to the September 11th catastrophe was the same exact response as the Bush administration's response? They would impeach her. They would have impeached her. She'd be impeached by now. I mean, in the Times, I guess, on the front page on Sunday, was a story saying that we've spent $4.5 billion so far for all the personnel and the new programs and the new equipment to make us safer against terrorism in response to 9/11. We all know about what it's like going to the airport now and going through the metal detectors and being searched and all this other kind of stuff. $4.5 billion. And what happens, according to the story in the Times, this stuff is not working, that the money was misspent. In a lot of cases, the personnel were not properly utilized. The equipment was either never suitable for the job that we expected from it, or it's already obsolete. That the ports, the airports, the rail yards, the nuke plants are not any safer now than they really were on September 10th, 2001. I mean, why isn't that a scandal? I mean, it was on page 1, but you don't hear much more about it. Why aren't people out there saying, well, then what the heck have we been doing for almost 4 years? And who's going to be held responsible for spending $4.5 billion and basically getting not much in return for your money? Who's going to be held responsible for this war? Nobody asks that question now. We don't even act like there's anybody who should be held responsible. The war's a disaster.
So, and this goes right back to the opening paragraph of your book. So, what is so wrong with the USA now that it cannot investigate itself? It cannot hold that kind of straight up, no hold bars investigation of what happened at Abu Ghraib. What is it about the country where the inability of the airports to increase their own security, despite the money that they spent, doesn't spark that kind of outrage? Is there a simple answer to that?
I don't think it's a simple answer, but I think one of the problems is that in addition to the presidency, both houses of Congress are in the hands of the Republican Party. So you don't have the committee chairs willing to call investigations, hold hearings, have subpoena power, and that sort of thing. If just one house, if the Democrats had just one house, you could have committee chairs, calling people down from the Defense Department, from the various aspects of the military. So you don't have that. I mean, when Lyndon Johnson was president, you had Democrats investigating the war in Vietnam. So that's one problem. The other problem, though, a big problem, is even though the Democrats don't control either house of Congress, they're still a major political party, and they're the party of opposition. And it's the Democrats, since we have essentially a two-party system, it's a representative democracy, it's the Democrats who should be holding the administration's feet to the fire on these issues. And that's just not happening. I mean, the Democrats are terminally timid. I think they've just flat wimped out on this stuff. And I don't think that the Democrats, as a political party, have upheld their responsibility to their constituents.
I'm just going to just remind you that there are microphones, I think, in both aisles, and we've got some time for Bob to take questions from you if you want to think something up or take a position at one of the mics. We can start on that in just a minute. There's a story that you use to start your book. It's a story of your boot camp days prior to Vietnam, and I'm not going to hijack it by taking it much further than that, but you quite clearly put that at the very front of the book because it meant a lot to you.
There was. I got drafted. I lived in Montclair, New Jersey, a small town about 12 miles outside New York. So I get drafted. I'm going to go down to Fort Dix, and you show up at the bus. I later learned that my uncle drove me to the bus in Montclair Center, and I later learned years later that my father had followed behind in his car and parked down the street and was watching me get on the bus and get taken off. And everybody thought I was going to Vietnam, but I didn't.
He didn't. He was there, but
my father never mentioned that to me. Either my uncle or my mother told me.
He didn't say anything to you as you were getting on the bus. He was just watching from.
He wasn't even there. I went in the car with my uncle.
Yeah.
I had left my father and my mother back at our house. I thought they were home.
Right.
And my father had gone down in his car and followed my uncle's car and then parked down the block and watched as I got on the bus to go off to Fort Dix. So anyway, we get into basic training. And for some reason, I sort of became the leader of a clique there. And there were a few guys from Montclair who were friends of mine that happened to get drafted on the same day. So suddenly, we're friends, and in that kind of alien environment where, your first few days in the Army, the idea that we could show sort of a false bravado because there was a group sort of turned on some of the other guys. So the other guys wanted to hang out with us. And this column was about two guys. One was Paul Conover, who was a friend of mine from Montclair, and one was Michael Farmer, who was a stranger. And I say in the column that we were there like shining boots in basic training and singing songs and smoking cigarettes, and Michael Farmer comes over and he wants to know if he can join us. So I told him, get lost. I look up, this is a big guy. He's a good-looking guy, but he behaved in kind of a doofus way, and I said, get out of here. And Paul Conover, who was a great happy-go-lucky guy, a guy with a big smile and everything, very friendly, he says, yeah, come on, let him sit down, And then, the farmer's going, you got a cigarette? I'm going, oh, my God, the guy doesn't have any cigarettes, Then I find out that he joined the Army. We had all gotten drafted. You joined the Army? What is the matter with you, He mumbled. I mentioned in the column that for the longest time I thought his girlfriend's name was Marilyn. I thought her name was Merlin. Her name was Marilyn. The guy couldn't even pronounce his girlfriend's name. He would come back night after night to hang out with us, and I would give him a hard time, but Conover would always get on my case and say, Bob, he's all right, leave him alone. And then after a while I got to liking Michael Farmer too. I mean, he really was. He was a sweet kid. He was only 17 years old, which is why he enlisted, and he enlisted for 4 years, not 3, which was just another one. I mean, I was like going to pass out from, the poor guy. Anyway, my sister has photos of us. My sister's 4 years younger. After basic training, we all went to Montclair, and they came over our house, and my family took pictures of all of us in the living room. I get sent to Korea, and Paul Conover and Michael Farmer got sent to Vietnam. And so the tours weren't that long. I spent 13 months in Korea, got extended a month, and then came home. They did, 12 months in Vietnam, and then they came home. And so we had this whole reunion. You're like, wow, we're all back, we're all whole, let's drink and have fun. Conover and I get out of the Army because we're draftees. Farmer's still in the Army. I went to work for a time being in my father's upholstery shop. And then Farmer gets orders to go back to Vietnam. And we're going, Michael, no, don't do it, fight it, call your congressman. But he came from a family down in Atlantic City where they really didn't, know how to go about it. He went back over there. And I just still can remember sitting in the back of my father's shop, and one day Conover comes in, and there was like a drapery to separate the showroom from the rear of the shop, and Conover comes in, and there's just tears pouring down his face, and all he said was, Conover didn't make it. Farmer didn't make it. And then he couldn't even really talk anymore. And I was like really devastated, and my sister was devastated, and, but that's what was happening in those days. So more time goes by, and I got a job finally at a newspaper at the Star-Ledger, and my life is doing okay. And I put in the story in the column that there was a big change when Conover and Farmer came back from Vietnam the first time. Conover had been, as I said, this happy-go-lucky guy, and Farmer had been this morose, mumbling, insecure person. Farmer became more secure, perhaps as a result of Vietnam, perhaps the military, perhaps just getting older, I don't know what. And he married his sweetheart, Marilyn, before he went back to Vietnam. Conover got married too, but when he came back from Vietnam, he was a wreck. And I remember him saying to me, he was drinking a tremendous amount, and I remember him saying to me, man, I just never thought that I could ever be that scared in my whole life. And then one day at the Star-Ledger, I worked nights as the night city editor, and I picked up the paper, and there had been a story that had gone through another editor, and it was in the paper, and it was about my friend Paul Conover, and he had gotten a gun somewhere and pulled up in front of his house, watched his wife get out of a car in front of the house. He took the gun, he killed his wife, and he killed himself. And what I said in the column was that this was on, the 25th anniversary of the end of the war. It was one of the Vietnam anniversaries that I wrote the column. And I said that I had gone down to the Vietnam Memorial in Washington just before I had written that column. And you're looking at the names on the wall, and I looked for Farmer's name, and there's Farmer's name. And, just sort of by mistake, I'm looking for Conover's name on that wall. Well, he didn't get killed in Vietnam. He killed himself, in Montclair. So his name's not on the wall, and then suddenly it dawned on me. But he was a casualty of that war just as sure as Farmer and the 58,000 others, and his wife, whose name I never knew, she was a casualty of that war. And the headline on the column was that the headline was a fool's errand. And Vietnam was a fool's errand, and it took us 58,000 American casualties before we realized it. And I think now that the war in Iraq is a fool's errand. And how long is it going to take us with this war before we wake up? How do we get out of there?
Okay, your turn. I'm going to go to this microphone first.
Hi, my name is Jerry Lance, and I teach at Emerson College. I wanted to, first of all, thank you for the work you've done not only in writing columns about Abu Ghraib, but also about extraordinary rendition and in general. I've really enjoyed your work and really respect it.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
I wanted to ask you you spoke about the Democratic Party's timidity. And with all due respect, I don't feel it on the opinion pages of the Times or on the editorial page of the Times, but even with the Times, and the Times less so than other news media, I do see some timidity in the press as well. Specifically, what I wanted to ask you is why, given that the military isn't investigating itself on Abu Ghraib, or is doing so very poorly, has the news media failed to keep that story on the front page and to keep the war on the front page? It often has, once we declare democracy and had an election, it has just sort of fallen off the front page and gone inside, and Abu Ghraib has as well. So that's my question.
I couldn't agree more about the media. I mean, take a stab at a few reasons. None of them good reasons. I think that the media is much more corporate now than it ever was. We talked about that earlier on the show, and I think most people understand that as far as the broadcast media is concerned, but it's more and more the case with print media as well. I think that there are far too many reporters who see power as the name of the game. They want access to power. They love being able to cover Washington. They love being among the insiders. And if you start feeling that way and then you become critical of the insiders, you can quickly find yourself an outsider. So I think that there's a lot of that going on. I think I've always realized that reporters and editors are drawn from the vast general public. So I think that they don't have a particular stake in this war any more than the public has a stake in the war. Their sons and daughters are not going off to Iraq fighting. I remember at the Star-Ledger, if they were going to build a freeway that was going to come near your editor's home, then that would suddenly become a front-page story at the Ledger. If some of these editors and reporters had kids who might have to go into the war zone, that story would become a bigger story, too. So I think that there's a lot of reasons. I'm sure there's a lot more than those that I've mentioned, but I do think that the media has fallen down on the job. Thanks for your question. Thanks. I appreciate it.
And over here, sir.
I love the way he asked that question. That was the major part of what I was going to ask you. Very similar. So I'll go back to my...
That's what it's like when you've got a column all geared up and then you find out one of your fellow columnists did it today.
Maybe you hit the punch. Yeah. I'll go back to my B question here. You're talking about the need for leaders to arise from population in general. My sense is that yeah, we're in desperate need of that. But what I find, or what I observe, is that whenever anybody actually raises their head up and they kind of throw their hat in the ring, the first thing they do is go out and hire somebody as a political consultant. And they put them right off their left shoulder, and they listen to everything they say. And what they end up becoming is the thing that I personally, and I know a lot of people around me, are unbelievably disgusted with, which is people wearing the mantle of leadership who are more committed to the maintenance and the acquisition of power than they are to serving us as a community and expressing what all of us want. And they actually cynically follow that path, and they get people who are experts in it, who year after year reinforce that model.
That's exactly. I'm sorry.
Go ahead, please.
Well, I think that's exactly right. And so in that case, leadership then becomes an empty word. I mean, they're not real leaders.
Absolutely.
It's like,
totally
empty. It's like patriotism becoming an empty word. Leadership means that you take a stand, and you have to take a stand that you believe in. Otherwise, it's lunacy, you know.
I'm a little young to really have the Kennedy legacy, but for me, like somebody in Massachusetts who everything I've ever known about him as a leader was Paul Tsongas, who really represented the community that he was in, listened to the people around him, and was out there to serve. Interestingly enough, Paul Tsongas started in the Peace Corps, spent time in the Peace Corps. So, I mean, there's so much that we are missing, and we lie to ourselves by allowing people like our president to be called our leaders, when in fact they are just people who are manipulating and dividing and clutching and fending off responsibility and doing everything that the Jesuits told me was a waste of my life.
Think for a minute about how much courage it would take for a leader to step forward without that angel on his or her shoulder.
But isn't that what the challenge is? Isn't that what, at his best, isn't that what Robert Kennedy did? He spoke, I'm sure he had political advisors who helped him understand, okay, this is where I want to go, how can I be most effective?
And Jack
but where he was coming from was a place with a vision for all of us, and that American dream that you opened up talking about.
He was moving in the face of the most powerful people in his party who were just you can't say how upset they were.
You can read his words 40 years later. You can read Martin Luther King's words 40 years later, and it brings tears to your eyes because you know that they're hitting the nail on the head.
Same thing with Martin Luther King. It wasn't just the civil rights movement. When he started talking about Vietnam and poverty, I mean, it was just such a courageous stand, but it was not the stand that he would have taken if he was listening to the pollsters and the political advisors.
Right. So if I can just close out, to go back to my first question was, you have the privilege of a forum that a lot of us don't have. I mean, I can sit here and talk. I mean, this is a great opportunity for me to express my opinion, but I don't get these very often, and you get them twice a week. So, I mean, if I can just throw a little friendly challenge at you, you have, you step out there, a lot of people are going to listen to what you say. You have established the groundwork of talking about and caring about justice.
Well, thank you very much. It is a privilege to write on the op-ed page. I'm going to try and continue that.
So, thanks.
Thanks so much.
Yeah. Over here, sir.
Hi, Bob. Roger House from Emerson College.
How you doing?
Hi. I heard you say earlier today that you're a Yankees fan. Careful. Careful.
No, you guys humbled me last year. It's continuing into this year. When's it going to end?
There's a danger here, Roger, though, of Red Sox fans becoming Yankees fans in the way that they kind of taunt, right? A little bit of humility required.
That's okay, because I'm a Mets fan. How about those Mets?
How about that,
Pedro? My question is related to New York City. They have an upcoming mayoral election. The city's been through a lot. September 11th tragedy, Amadou Diallo tragedy, conflict between the black community and the former mayor. What do you see as the issues that will be important in this election? And do you see the black community having true representation amongst the politicians who are coming to the forefront at this time?
the latter part of your question is easier to answer. No, there's not a lot of representation of blacks, in New York City at the moment. The issues that would be important to a lot of the black residents are not getting much attention. I think Michael Bloomberg, who's running for re-election this year, will most likely get re-elected. Like on the national level, a Democrat, he's a Republican, like on the national level, the Democratic opposition is extremely weak. I mean, even weaker in New York City. And Bloomberg's got a few things going for him. He's done as good a job, I think, as anybody probably could have done on the economy, which was a big deal, especially in the recession post-September 11th. Crime is still down in New York, way down. That's always a huge issue. You mentioned that there had been strife between the black community and the prior mayor, and New York sort of almost traditionally had racial or ethnic strife or turmoil of some sort. That has not been the case during the time that Bloomberg has been mayor, so he's got that going for him. And he's got $4 or $5 billion of his own money, so he can spend $100 million and not miss it on commercials. So it'll be very tough getting him out of there. Thanks for your question. I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you.
All right.
Over here. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Jack Fox. I'm a retired Army officer.
How are you?
Two little things really quickly on leadership. Man, there's a whole range of different type of leaderships and so forth. That's not my real question, but leadership frequently depends on situations and so forth. And one day a person who's a leader today, tomorrow may not be a leader if leaders need followers. Can't lead if nobody follows. You can still have leadership characteristics, but that's anyway. My real question is focused on, we were talking about our commitment to Iraq, whether we agree or don't agree on going over there, and your comments about, we'd like to be successful, win this thing, and leave. And that's precisely my question. How do we, from your perspective, find leaving, if we follow leaving with the example of Vietnam, was not success. We can't call that success. Right. So given that framework, looking at the Iraq situation and so forth, from your perspective, how do we end this on a successful note, but just not leave? Just from your perspective, that's what I'm interested, really.
That's why it's a tough question. I don't see this scenario. I can't imagine how you take the 150,000 American troops who are there, pack them up, just let them leave, let Iraq fall into turmoil. I mean, one of the hideous things about this war is that Iraq would, under those circumstances, become a haven for terrorists and then would become more of a threat to the United States. I mean, it's sort of a bizarre sequence of events that they've gotten us into here. So I certainly don't have an easy answer to your question. But I think the important point now is that you get the best minds in the United States and also
the world
consultation outside of the United States and see what is the best case scenario for proceeding. And I don't think that the Bush administration, the powers that be in the Bush administration, are the best minds for making that determination.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks, Jack. Ma'am.
I'd like to ask your thoughts on the role of revenge as an explanation for why Americans have been so passive about this terrible mess in Iraq. Was the need to just wreak havoc so great because of the hurt of what happened to us that we really don't care? And I raise this question because James Carroll, a Boston Globe columnist, wrote a column just on this very subject several days ago, and he made a very compelling case for it playing, he saw it as being sort of maybe a major explanation for why we have allowed ourselves to be lied to and have not cared too much about what has happened.
Well, he's written a lot of compelling columns on these issues. I think revenge was one of the main factors, and I think the idea of the desire for revenge in the population at large is what made it as easy as it was for the administration to sell the war in Iraq. I mean, they didn't have any trouble with Afghanistan. I mean, most Americans thought that there was sufficient and good reason for going into Iraq. It provided the sanctuary for folks who had actually attacked the United States. But as I went around in the early days of the Iraq War talking to people, you'd just be surprised, or maybe you wouldn't be surprised, at the number of people who felt that they had attacked us or they were involved. And the polls bore that out, where they thought that Saddam was directly involved in the attack on September 11th. So I think that was a big factor. I think it's becoming less of a factor now because people are getting, to the extent that they're paying attention to the war, they're getting tired of the war. And, I mean, I don't know what the polls would show now, but I would hope at least that there are fewer people who think that Saddam was involved. But you've also got the factor that Saddam is no longer in power. So I think that the revenge factor is now less of a factor.
You wrote about that in the piece about Delgado. I was listening to you and remembering this officer top officer making wisecracks about soldiers heading off to Iraq to, and I'm quoting you here, kill some ragheads and burn some turbans.
Yep. Mm-hmm. That's the way they were firing up troops. I mean, this is another thing that you don't get. When the military or the administration, and I am certainly not anti-military, but when they are doing their number for the public, it's a public relations number. So they would have you believe that the soldiers are over there, and they're handing out candy to the Iraqi kids and they're opening up schools and that sort of thing. And there is a fair amount of that going on. But that is not what the mindset is when you're going into combat, and that's not what the mindset is supposed to be. When we were in basic training, you had to scream over and over and over again at the top of your lungs that you're killers. I mean, I can imitate it, but I won't. But it's just you're killers. And what is your point? To kill, to kill. And they would show every different way to kill other human beings. Well, that's what you need to know. That's how you should be trained if you're going to go into combat against people who are trying to kill you. But you can do that without becoming some kind of racist fanatic, And so when you're going to fight a war in Iraq, and then you start telling these young, impressionable soldiers and Marines that the point is not just to kill the enemy, but to kill ragheads and to burn turbans, then suddenly the mindset is that anyone who's an Arab or anyone who's a Muslim, even our allies, are less than human, and we can treat those folks any way we want. And there's been a lot of that going on.
Over here, ma'am, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Sheila Carlton, and first I want to thank you for your wonderful, perceptive columns. It's just so refreshing to read someone who tells it like it is.
Thank you so much.
Great.
Thank you.
And my question is, why are the Democrats in Congress such wimps? Why don't they,
I wish I could answer that question. Maybe, just maybe, part of it is this idea. They may be listening to their advisors much too much and for far too long. But I remember at the end of this last presidential election when everybody was saying, now you see the Democrats are going to have to pay more attention to this values issue, and religion is more important in American politics than we had previously imagined, and suddenly, Hillary is like plunging towards the middle, which is, where do we think Hillary was in the first place anyway? So I think that a lot of Democratic politicians really believe that if they could just get a little bit closer to what they perceive the mainstream to be, then they're going to triumph. Whether it's Kerry or whether it's Gore or whether it's your local congressperson or a senator, there's always this idea, well, the Republicans won some elections or they're in the majority, so they must know something we don't, and so we need to become more like them. And I just think that that's insanity. I mean, the Democrats keep doing this, and they keep losing elections. When are they going to catch on? I don't know.
They don't have the courage of their conviction.
They don't.
They don't seem to learn anything.
There's one other thing. The Democrats really, they sprint away from their natural base. I mean, you see Bush up there saying, you know, the evangelicals are part of the natural base of the Republican Party and crucially important to the party. You'll never see Bush running away from them or insulting them or whatever. But liberals, blacks, labor, Democrats are always like distancing themselves. You know, yeah, we do want your vote, you know, and yeah, sign up, you know, and make sure you get out there early and that sort of thing. And then they go on television and well, as I was saying, you know, I think the Republicans may have something on this, and you know, the word black won't pass their lips, you know, and liberal, no, you don't want to start using words like, it's just kind of bizarre. You know, the folks who are the strongest supporters of your party, those are the folks that you're distancing yourself from. I don't see how that ever becomes a winning strategy.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
As you look at the country and various aspects, I wondered if you'd comment on how you perceive the role of the Christian right and what's going on and what will go on.
Well, I mean, the role of the Christian right, I mean, obviously they have as much right as anyone else to participate in American politics. The problem becomes, what does a triumphant party give to the Christian right in return, and what does that do to sort of the makeup of this country? And what we're moving towards now is one-party rule. The Republicans in control of, you know, everything, the presidency, both houses of Congress, and increasingly the judiciary. And then the natural progression from that is the erosion of the checks and balances, which have been so important to this country. One of the things that makes the United States special. The Republicans are complaining that it's not easy to get legislation through Congress. Well, that was the idea. It's not supposed to be easy to make fundamental changes in the United States. It's supposed to be very difficult. It can get frustrating, but it's worked for a long time. And then the other thing that's happening as a result of the emergence of the Christian right is the undermining of the wall separating church and state, which, you know, my view strongly is that's a move in the wrong direction as well. So those are some of the factors.
Sir.
My question is about the future and what we can do next. Within, I think it was a week or two after the election, you wrote a column that was basically, okay, we all have the blues, let's kick it and start a revolution.
All right.
And it was a great article. I had been working with Move On, and it really helped me literally get out of bed. Literally.
You'd been in bed for a week.
Kind of. So
you were not alone.
A lot of people were depressed.
Fortunately. I was, unfortunately. So my question is the next step. You started saying you started tonight talking about the American dream, and also talking about kind of being able to rally around the nonpartisan issue of the astronauts. This is 30 years ago. So my question is there anything that we can rally around right now that is not going to be turned into a partisan issue? And if not, what else can we do?
Well, I think it's difficult, but one of the things that I think would be really important to rally around, and that I'd like to see more on campuses about this, is the idea of the quality of the education across the country, and then just start preschool and go all the way up. Now, we've had a great higher education system in this country, and oddly enough, this administration is not all that helpful even in that area. But you want to preserve that. And then because an education is so important to the generations coming up now, much more so than the generations that passed, you want to build as strong an education system as possible. Now, to what extent can that be a nonpartisan issue? I don't know. There's a lot of partisanship in it, but education would be the kind of issue where probably you could get a pretty wide range of people in support of it. So
But don't you need a thing? I mean, don't you need one point around which people can rally, whether or not it's a case or a story or some particular aspect of the education system which just fires people up? And I mean, it's at present so broad.
I mean, I think that's true. But you know, I think that you can narrow the focus and say, not in the way that the president's saying it, but say it's a scandal if we're running kids through primary and secondary school systems who can't read and who can't add and subtract. I mean, just start with the fundamentals and make it clear why this is happening, because there are people who understand why this is happening, and there are a lot of programs out there, a lot of them, that actually work, and a lot of programs that work with underprivileged and inner city kids, for example. So it's a kind of thing that I think if you had the proper leadership, you could get a fair number of people to rally around. But it's difficult. I mean, we're in a difficult political period. People are at each other's throats.
And education especially, I mean, I agree with you that it seems to be the kind of thing where we all have a similar common goal in mind.
And it's just so important. It's legitimately important.
Absolutely. But especially, I'm from New York City, and I grew up in the New York City public school system. And so when I'm thinking about the public school history, I'm thinking about New York. But especially there, the issue has been so polarized
very much
between the parties. And I can't imagine that it's ever been an issue that the parties or any parties could agree on. Well, we have the same common goal. How do we get there? That seems to be the same issue no matter what.
I mean, I think that with the proper leadership, you can make the case that there are some things that we can come to an agreement on, that this is the sort of thing that both sides can agree on. So let's pursue that, and the stuff that we're going to fight about, let's put that aside for a moment. But I mean, I think that there are any number of issues. If education is not the issue, then housing can be the issue. If housing is not the issue, then employment can be the issue. What I think is going to happen, though, is that, you know, the leadership will emerge on angry issues. I think people at some point are going to become angry about the war. So, you know, that may not be as constructive as rallying around education or employment, but that tends to be the kind of thing that happens. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am, go ahead.
Hello, my name's Dorothy Stoneman, and I subscribe to the New York Times so that I can read you and Paul Krugman.
Thank you so much. Paul is a big addition.
I thank you very much for writing what I feel to be the truth all the time. I am also chairman of the Youth Build Coalition, which is 900 organizations across the country that have been united around trying to build bipartisan support for the past 15 years for the second chance systems for the million young people who are dropping out of high school, or the 500,000 to 1 million, whatever, every year. And we have difficulty getting the press to cover something where there is success, where there is bipartisan support. Last week, 53 senators called for a 50% increase in the funding for the Youth Build program. You send out a press release, nobody picks it up, that there's bipartisan support for anything that is going to have a positive effect on the poorest young people in America who've been most oppressed and who have dropped off the edge of society. I guess I have two questions. You've written beautifully about this population over and over again. If you were to write about solutions, because you've written mostly about the problems, right? What would you write if you wrote about the solutions? And the other half of the question is, how do we get attention to the solutions and to the fact that there is bipartisan support for some of the solutions?
I think that it's very difficult, because some of the problems now are so huge. It might have been easier 10 or a dozen years ago. Not easy, but easier. But in a post-September 11th world, where you're competing with the huge, what I think of as legitimate stories, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, terrorism, torture, and then the domestic issues of the economy, and on and on and on. And then you also have to deal with the madness of, the celebrity journalism and the crazy stories and that sort of thing. It becomes very, very hard, and I don't have an answer for you on that one. You have to concentrate on local publications because it's easier to get coverage there. than in the big national publications. But even there, it's just extremely hard. What if I were running an organization like that, I would get 2 or 3 people together who are extremely creative and try and think of different ways to come up with a specific story that's so compelling, or maybe a piece of art that's so compelling that it almost draws the cameras or it draws the reporters. But that's a lot easier said than done.
And that's about the media attention. If you were to write about the solutions to the 2.5 million young people who are out of school and out of work and are poor, what would you write?
In 700 words, you just take one sliver of it. I've written stuff, for example, about the KIPP schools, but you just take one sliver of it, one small slice, and maybe you talk to a couple of kids, of which it's heartbreaking. Only one's going to get into the column because of space, and then you do that. But the problem is that even with one column, you can't keep coming back to it, which is what you need to do to be effective. So,
thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
We have time for 2 more. So those people who are at the back, my apologies, but.
Sorry.
Well, I'm really glad that I stood up when I did, Mr. Herbert. I had never really read your column in the New York Times, but I did email you last week, and you very politely and very nicely emailed me back to thank you for emailing you. But I figured that you probably don't get many people who email you with praise. So, and I also told you, I don't know whether you'll remember, but I told you that I don't read the Times, I read the mini-me of the New York Times, which is the Boston Globe. And I thought that would be a clever thing that you wouldn't forget.
It worked.
But anyhow, I could spend a whole night here talking to you because, for one thing, the 2 young men before me, I was a Boston public school teacher for 40 years, and I managed to last for 40 years, but for the last, say, 20 years of those 40 years, I was on the receiving end of tremendous criticism and lack of respect from the media especially.
Really?
And, and the Boston Globe, the mini-me. And they're even doing it now. They're saying that my union, the Boston Teachers Union, is standing in the way of progress in the Boston public schools. They said that 20, 30 years ago. Okay, so what I've gone on to is bigger and better things, which is anti-war work. And I am finding out, Mr. Herbert, that I am quite far to the left of you. And I also am an anti-war.
Explain that to people.
Well, I'm an anti-war activist, and I mean an activist. I just was at a meeting last night, and for one thing, I see, I guess, and I hate.
I'm going to bring you to a question if I can, because we're really.
Oh, please. Well, anyhow, no.
The media just continues to persecute you.
I know, but you gave that. I'm always doing this, but anyhow, okay. What I see is America becoming an imperialist nation, and we haven't touched on our role with the rest of the world. Secondly, one of the parts of that is that I am in touch with groups on the internet, not in the newspaper, who are saying that Bush, I believe everything he does is with the approval of the Democrats in Congress, is planning an attack on Iran.
Okay.
And number one, they have the largest natural gas reserve.
Let's take the first part.
I'm telling you, I told you I could go on all night.
Right. We know. Thank you very much. I'm going to try and address your point. I encourage the anti-war movement. I want to hear more from it because the anti-war movement will generate the kind of conversation that I think is necessary and that we're not having in this country. As for Iran, I have no idea whether we're planning to invade Iran. My best guess is that we're not, because logistically it doesn't sound like the brightest move for the United States at the moment. But in any event, I hope that we're not. In terms of American imperialism, yeah, I think that we've become an imperialist nation, and I think that's to be regretted. Thank you.
And that we're racist too. It's racism too in terms of Iraq.
Sure.
Yes. I enjoyed your column today, and it was a double header because Krugman wrote also as well, and that keeps my blood pressure down a great deal. I would like to say just a couple of things. One, in the Battle for Fallujah, we lost 30% of the Marines, mostly because they didn't have the armored vehicles. However, they did have a prayer book given by the president to every one of the Marines that asked them to pray for the president.
I did not realize.
I hope you all appreciate that. I know I certainly did. I was reading Vanity Fair, and Bobby Kennedy Jr. had an article in there, and in it, one of the media executives questioned Sumner Redstone, a lifelong Democrat, about his position of kowtowing to the Bush administration, particularly holding back criticism and so on and so forth. And his answer was, I'm doing this because I've got to do it. I have to buy radio and television stations, and the Republicans are letting me do it, and the only way they're letting me do it is if I do hold back. I think that's probably what the problem with a great deal of the media is. Would you comment on that, please?
Well, I mean, I think I have commented on the media. I think that, the corporatization of the media is a huge problem, and the people within the media, not much different from people in any other walk of life, they gravitate towards power and success. I mean, I think that that's pretty natural, and probably more natural than usual in the United States. And so it's something that you have to try and fight against, and that's difficult. I mean, we worship success in this country, and if there is one common religion in the country, it's the pursuit of the almighty dollar. So, it's very difficult to get outside those paradigms, But if you're going to make major change in the country, then you do have to think in a different way.
Thank you very much. One last comment that I have for you. A tough guy who just resigned as Attorney General had 7 deferments.
Yeah, right.
Okay, one short bit of business. Bob Herbert has a few moments which he will spend in the hall that you all know where you came in, signing copies of his new book, Promises Betrayed. I want to thank you for your patience and your own civic responsibility in taking the time to spend some time with us here. Thank the Kennedy Library for putting this together, and in particular I'd like you to ask me in joining Bob Herbert for the work that he does.